Steve, C.S. Lewis wrote Mere Christianity, which I believe was things put together from either he talked on the radio or there were previous publications, broadcast talks, Christian behaviour and Beyond Personality. Now, we're both reading it. Anything to say about, for instance, what he talks about in the preface? Because there's quite a lot of stuff we can cover here.
Yeah, there's a hell of a lot of stuff that we could cover here. I mean, he talks about an awful lot of the thinking that probably has convinced him as to why he believes Christianity is the path to walk. And he slowly unpacks that.
Right.
He tries to bring that out. One of the things that I found quite interesting when I was reading Mere Christianity was that he wasn't trying to tell you whether or not what sort of Christian you should become. So he wasn't trying to say, you need to be an Anglican, you need to be a Methodist, you need to be a Baptist, you need to be a Prezi, whatever it is. That's not his intent here. His intent was just trying to explain why he had become a Christian and how he would explain that process that led him to that point. And I think that one of the things that he does is that he lines up that there is far more in common, and we've talked about this with denominations and institutions of Christianity, that most Christians have far more in common than they have against each other. So stand on the common ground and actually recognise how much you've got going for you. So you've read it, you've read the opening of this, you've read the preface, you've gone through this. What are your thoughts about what he's got to say?
Well, again, you've got to be careful you're not lifting things slightly out of context. But as I say, there is a lot here, and I'm holding up the book so you can see what I've written. On page 9, it's the final full paragraph. He talks about objections to the word Christian. And he said, against my use of the word Christian to mean one who accepts the common doctrines of Christianity. People ask, who are you to lay down who is and who is not a Christian? Or may not many a man who cannot believe these doctrines be far more truly a Christian, far closer to the Spirit of Christ than some who do? Now this objection is in one sense very right, very charitable, very spiritual, very sensitive. It has every available quality except that of being useful.
Yep.
I mean, he talks about we cannot, without disaster, use language as these objectors want us to use it. So what do you think he's trying to say there?
I think he's trying to actually crystallise what a Christian is. And so somebody who acts in a very charitable way, in a very loving, kind way, that does not make them Christian. It makes their behaviours consistent with what a Christian should be, but it doesn't make them Christian.
Right.
And so I think he's trying to use the word Christian in a very particular sense. And in the sense that I understand it from reading him, it is a follower of Christ. You are a Christ follower. And that means that he can lay that down because that's the term that he's using it. As we've spoken about before when we were talking about, a little while ago, I mentioned about Richard Dawkins, who considers himself a cultural Christian, but yet he's an atheist and he doesn't follow Christ. And so therefore he's actually not a Christian, but he's Christian in terms of a cultural upbringing and living in a technically Christian country. So C.S. Lewis is trying to be more pointed than that, I think. He's trying to actually define what a Christian is. And so when he talks about Christian, he's talking about somebody who is a Christ follower. Now, I don't know if he actually opens that up as we track through the preface. He may well do.
Well, I've got down here, he's talking about the word gentleman and how it became common currency, especially through the 19th century, or you're a gentleman. But of course, the original meaning meant something else. It meant that you had a title of potentially land. And he said, when a word ceases to be a term of description and becomes merely a term of praise, it no longer tells you facts about the object. It only tells you about the speaker's attitude to that object. And if anyone, say, in an historical work wants to use the word gentleman in its old sense, he cannot do so without explanations. It has been spoiled for that purpose. And I just thought, is he trying to say then that the word Christian has been slightly spoiled for too many people because it's not denoting what it should do?
Yes, I think he does, because and he actually sort of articulates that point midway down on page 11, where he says, in calling anyone a Christian, they will mean that they think him a good man. i.e., if you are a Christian, you are a good man. Well, that's not what being Christian is. Good by comparison to who? God? Do me a favour. That's not what it is. Christians, it's not about being a good man. Being Christian is about being a follower of Christ. And so he starts to stick, and he goes on in that final paragraph, we must therefore stick to the original obvious meaning. The name Christians was first given at Antioch in Acts 11:26 to the disciples, to those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. Then he moves on to talk about that when a man who accepts the Christian doctrine lives unworthily of it, it is much clearer to say that he is a bad Christian than to say that he is not a Christian. I think that he's actually identifying a Christian as somebody who sits under the doctrine of Christ and who is a Christ follower, in line with the longest tradition. So you can't just say a good man is a Christian.
Yeah.
A good man may well be a Christian.
I marked the same bit that you just mentioned. I was staggered when I read it, because it's like, hang on, what he's saying is Christian came from here.
Yeah.
You would assume Christians would know that. But I came across a Christian recently. When I asked what religion was Jesus, they said Christian. And I said, well, who's he following then? Who was the Christ before him? If you're a Christ follower and he is already a Christ follower alive, then who was before him? And I didn't know whether I'd misheard him or misunderstood. Perhaps it was a slip of the tongue. But the fact that, when was this written? Just after the war, wasn't it? Because he mentions the Nazis. The fact he's saying the same thing. The obvious meaning, the name Christians was first given. The fact that he has to say that.
Nothing's changed, Mark, in 80-odd years. People haven't become any more enriched in terms of the knowledge of what they believe. And I think even less so, because Christianity has become almost like a political tag as well. You are part of the Christian West. Well, the Western nations aren't Christian. They may have been founded on a Christian principle. They may have been founded on Christian philosophy. They may have been built, and the laws may have all been run from the Ten Commandments and all the rest of it. But they are secular nations today. Every one of the Western nations are secular nations where you can live whatever you want and be whatever you want. And that doesn't mean to say that you have to follow Christ. Being Christian is a follower of Christ. And I think that C.S. Lewis is right to try and clearly define what he means as he talks about mere Christianity, because he's merely a follower of Christ. There's a quote that I like of C.S. Lewis, and he gave it to a Socratic group maybe in Oxford. He was doing a talk there, and he was doing a talk on his theology poetry. And he says that I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun rising, not because I see it, but by it I see everything else. I looked at that quote and I've changed that, and I say I believe in Christ, like I believe that the sun rises, not because I see it, but by him I see everything else. You see, so Christianity is Christ, in my opinion. We are followers of Christ, so it is in Christ that you see everything else. And I think C.S. Lewis is really trying to drill that point down as he starts to open up this book, Mere Christianity. It's all about Christ.
And as to that, why C.S. Lewis? The back information, the blurb, I love it. Mainly because of the language. You've got to think in clipped English, 1946. Thus are gathered together for the first time at a popular price Dr. Lewis's modern revaluations of Christian apologetics, ethics and theology. In fact, all the central problems of belief and of conduct which face Christians today. The author is now firmly established as one of the most notable thinkers of this or any generation, and the appearance of Mere Christianity in its new format will be widely welcomed. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think this has stood the test of time, this book. As I say, from talks that he did on the radio in 1942 onwards, I think it stood the test of time. And I think that the love him, loathe him, again, not everybody would agree with C.S. Lewis and some of his philosophy of life or indeed some of his theology. But he was a lover of Christ, and he really demonstrated that well, I believe. He's an interesting dude.
It's going to be a very interesting book to go through then, and no doubt we'll be doing it in some depth, Steve.
You never know, mate. We'll do it alongside the other things that we're digging trenches on.
Yes.
We've got a bit of depth going on there, bud.
Okay then. So we'll carry on in the next episode.
You take care for that. Catch you later. Bye-bye.
Take care.